Your lecturer is Dr. Michael H. Fisher. Dr. Fisher is the Robert S. Danforth Professor of History at Oberlin College, where he offers a range of courses on the history of South Asia, the environmental history of the Indian subcontinent, Pakistan, Mahatma Gandhi, and early travel narratives about India. He earned his Ph.D. in history with a concentration on South Asia from the University of Chicago in 1978. Professor Fisher has published 12 books and more than 50 articles on aspects of Indian history. Since 1971, he has lived, researched, and taught for long periods in India, with shorter trips to Pakistan and Bangladesh.
Mount Meru, the legendary peak regarded as the center of the world and the paradise home of the gods, has long carried great cultural power in many of the religious traditions of India, including Buddhism and Hinduism. From Mount Meru radiate the several great land masses, the southern continent being what we call India. Surrounding oceans encircle these continents. From the perspective of those ancient cultures, this sacred geography makes sense and explains knowledge available to them at that time. Mount Meru stands as what in European tradition was called the Axis Mundi. Of course, only some of India's many religious traditions incorporate this model for the earth into their specific cosmology, and many other cultures and people living on the vast Indian subcontinent don't share it at all. Still, because it maps onto the outsider's more literal understanding of the region in revealing ways, this model serves as an interesting starting point for a broad survey of the land and people of India. For only by studying all of the diverse Indian cultures in their own terms can we see not only their shared features, but also their great differences. And, to a large extent, it is the geography of a region and its associated dangers, its mountain peaks and passes, its rivers and plains, and its seacoasts, as well as its earthquakes and seasonal monsoons, its floods and drought, that defines the history and cultures of its people. The Indian subcontinent is almost as large as the US or Western Europe. South Asia has, throughout its history, contained a far greater population than both the Americas and Europe combined. Starting some 60 to 70,000 years ago, various groups, each with its own cultural heritage and social organization, immigrated and settled in each ecologically specific region of the subcontinent. Over subsequent centuries, the developments of their economy, diet, and general ways of life have been shaped by that region's distinct physical environment, including natural factors like the amount of rainfall, the flow of rivers, effects of mountain ranges, and location on the coast or inland. One result has been dozens of different languages, each region developing and still having one or more of its own, and also having many localized distinct dialects. Some single provinces within India today, for example, have the same population as today's Brazil, Germany, or Italy. Pakistan and Bangladesh each individually has more people than Russia or Japan. So while outsiders may think of the Indian subcontinent as one place, in fact, it has rarely ever been united under a single ruler. It contains dozens of distinct languages, some, like Hindi, with hundreds of millions of speakers, some endangered ones with only a handful of speakers remaining. The best way to understand the present condition of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh is to follow their development from the origins of humans in the subcontinent through their long history up to the present. Today, the people of South Asia total 20% of the entire world's population. They individually and collectively have a rich array of achievements, but they also face vital challenges. Over these lectures, we will explore the reasons that this major part of humanity has developed in its own distinctive ways over long historical time. Now, my own engagement with India began when I was still in college and had the opportunity in 1970-71 to live and study as an undergraduate in India, with a brief visit to Pakistan. Both India and Pakistan were new nations, less than 25 years old, about my own age. The last bloody war between those two nations had only happened 6 years earlier. Indeed, during my first stay, India and Pakistan went to war yet again. The country that was West and East Pakistan split, with East Pakistan breaking away to become the new nation of Bangladesh. As air raid warnings sounded, I remember that the major city of Bombay, also Mumbai, was completely blacked out at night. The famous Taj Mahal had burlap sacks covering its dome so that the moonlight, usually such a lovely illumination, would not alert feared Pakistani warplanes about where to drop their bombs. Fortunately, neither India nor Pakistan yet had nuclear weapons, although these would come soon enough. But many thousands of soldiers, and perhaps up to 3 million civilians, died in that war before Bangladesh was born. These dramatic changes, even within my own lifetime, are characteristic of the dynamic changes found throughout the long history of the subcontinent. Since that first visit, I have frequently lived, studied, and taught in India for extended periods, with more briefly doing so in Bangladesh as well. Over those 4 decades, I have been publishing books and articles, teaching and speaking about the history of the people and cultures of this complex and fascinating region of the world. In particular, many of my books have looked at 4 centuries of interactions between the people from South Asia and the people from the West, as they occurred both in India and also as men and women from India emigrated to Europe. I have never ceased to be fascinated by all that I continue to learn about Indian history. I trust you will find it as exciting and edifying as I do. In our journey through Indian history, we are able to draw upon a great variety of historical evidence produced by and about Indians over these 50 centuries. Much of this evidence comes from the physical objects that Indians have produced, including artifacts, works of art, and buildings. Some of these date back to 5,000 years ago. Many of India's cultures also developed rich bodies of literature, initially passed down orally, but then written in clay, in sewn inscriptions, and then on palm leaves. These enable us to understand how the people at that time understood themselves and the people in the world around them. In addition, outsiders have also been writing about India's culture and people for thousands of years. Often these accounts by outsiders differ from those composed by Indians, but each gives us a deeper insight into the other. In order to understand the people living on the Indian subcontinent from their origins up till today, we should start by exploring the environment. First, the land itself, next, the atmosphere, and third, the interactions between them. Throughout these lectures, we'll see how this complex environment affected the culture and people of India, and how they altered that environment. Let's start with geography. While we today think of India as part of Asia, that has not always been true. About 100 million years ago, the huge mass of rock and earth that we know today as the southern part of Asia was then located on the Earth's south pole, next to Africa and Antarctica, and part of a huge supercontinent. As scientific research has demonstrated, plate tectonics, or continental drift, has always been reshaping the surface of the Earth. This huge Indian tectonic plate is composed of a crust of solidified stone, some 20 to 60 miles thick, floating on the hot, molten rock below. Gradually breaking away from the southern continent, this Indian plate moved northward across what is today the Indian Ocean. As Africa and other future continents also separated, various prehistoric species of plants and animals that were spread across this supercontinent were also divided. These species subsequently evolved in distinctive ways, but it would be a long time into the future before human beings came into existence. Impelled by uprising molten rock, the Indian tectonic plate moved about as fast as your fingernails grow, slowly in human time, but rapidly in geological time. By about 30 million years ago, this Indian plate began smashing into the larger Asian plate, forcing itself under and twisting in the process. Most of the major geological features of India today resulted from this impact and are still slowly changing. One of the major effects of this plate tectonic movement has been the creation of various mountain ranges. Along India's north rise the vast Himalayan mountains. These mountains are actually the southern edge of the Asian tectonic plate, which continues to lift up today as the Indian plate slides beneath it. Now, this means that every time someone climbs Mount Everest, for example, they're going up a still rising mountain. But the vast weight of these mountains and the continued grinding of these two plates causes occasional earthquakes, often of great magnitude. These can have devastating effects on the people living in the area of the epicenter. India, Pakistan, and Nepal have all suffered severe earthquakes already in this century. Compared to America's Rocky Mountains, the Himalayas are much higher and wider. Nepal and Tibet lie in this Himalayan mountain region, with historic connections both to India and to China. But these mountains are so difficult to cross that there has been relatively little direct exchange between India and China, even though these two major world civilizations lie on either side of the same mountain range. Most of the other mountain passes are obstructed by snow and ice all winter. Indeed, one of the major mountain ranges in the western Himalayas, called the Hindu Kush, which may mean death for Hindus, since so many Indian merchants and other travelers died there. Only in 1978 did an all-weather road through the western Himalayan mountain range called the Karakoram link China and South Asia. It took nearly 20 years and the lives of over 1,000 Pakistani and Chinese workers to carve through the high glacial passes, about 15,400 feet above sea level. However, the 2010 earthquake blocked this lone highway by rubble and by an unstable high-elevation lake. Because of the angle that the Indian plate smashed into Asia, the mountains in India's northeast are rugged but not as steep. This means that people from Southeast Asia, especially from what is today Thailand and Burma or Myanmar, have interacted with people in India's northeast quite extensively over time, with migrations of people, ideas, and trade goods between them. Many of the people living in northeastern India speak Tibeto-Burman languages, showing the mixing of cultures in that region. If you enjoy Thai food, for example, you can recognize how similar it is to Indian food, but also somewhat different. That is just one reflection of these exchanges over time. In India's northwest, the mountains are very rugged, but rivers have carved passes through them. The most famous is the Khyber Pass that currently runs from Kabul in Afghanistan into Pakistan. This is a relatively narrow and twisting passage. Many immigrants from Iran, Afghanistan, and Central Asia have walked or ridden animals through the Khyber Pass and other passes into India from the northwest over the centuries. And much trade has also passed through them in each direction. Many invading armies have marched into India or out of it. But many have also been decimated by the local people shooting down from the steep walls of the Khyber Pass or halted by defending forts. However, over India's long history, most successful invaders have fought their way through the Khyber Pass and other passes in the northwest. Once settled in North India, these conquerors have often prepared to defend their new kingdoms against the next set of invaders from the northwest. So blocking the Khyber Pass has been an important strategy for many rulers of India's northwest quarter. At the same time, the cuisine of Afghanistan and that of North India have many distinctive features in common. like naan or roundish wheaten bread cooked in a blistering oven. While the land formations we've been describing have deeply affected invasion and trade routes, the sea has historically appeared for people living in India to be a means of trade and therefore prosperity. India has long coastlines, although relatively few secure natural harbors. People, ideas, and trade goods have moved back and forth across the Indian Ocean and the Bay of Bengal for thousands of years. Most people who arrived by sea were sailors, merchants, holy men, and immigrants who settled in India. As a result, historically, Indian rulers have rarely feared people arriving by sea. But then, in 1498, the Portuguese admiral Vasco da Gama discovered a direct sea passage around southern Africa that reached India. This began the long process of invasion by Europeans from the sea. Starting in the late 18th century, the British established and expanded their colonial rule, conquering inland from the coasts. The impact from the collision between the Indian and Asian tectonic plates also tilted India. The western edge of the Indian plate rose up, while the eastern edge remained lower. Hence, running just inland along the western coast is a long mountain range called the Western Ghats. Since Ghat means steep stairs, you get a sense of how much this mountain range rises up to separate the narrow coastal plain from India's interior. There is also a coastal mountain range along the east, but these eastern Ghats are less imposing since that edge of the Indian plate did not rise up. Between the western and eastern Ghats is the central Indian upland called the Deccan Plateau. This contains some of the oldest rocks on the planet, the vestiges of the original Indian tectonic plate that started its existence at the South Pole. In addition to being twisted and tilted, the Indian plate also crumpled from the impact and the continued force of this tectonic plate moving northward. This created internal mountain ranges, most running west-east. Over the long centuries, most of these internal mountains have been eroded into rugged hills, but they still make it difficult to cross them. Because of this tilt in the Indian plate and these internal mountain ranges, many of India's major rivers run from west to east across the subcontinent. Only two major rivers run differently. The Narmada River runs east to west along the northern edge of the Deccan upland, and the Indus River drains the western plain southward along the mountains that are now in Afghanistan. All these mountains and rivers mean that there are four distinct macro regions. First, a flat plain that runs across the north surrounding the famous Ganges River. For many outsiders, the Ganges River evokes images of Hindu devotees bathing to purify themselves. Second, India's central upland is a rugged and often dry plateau known as the Deccan. Third, the vast Indus River runs from the Himalayas southward to the Indian Ocean. The Indus waters an otherwise dry plain. This forms the core of Pakistan today. Finally, India's southeastern plain, today covered by wet rice paddies, is the agriculturally rich part of India's peninsular tip. Very rarely have these four macro regions ever been united under one single government. Instead, much like comparably sized Western Europe, most of India's long history has seen many different rulers in each of its geologically and geographically defined macro regions. Now let's turn our attention to the climate and important weather patterns of India. Out of the annual interaction between these land formations and the atmosphere comes India's dominant rainfall pattern, the monsoons. This term comes from the Arabic word for season, since for about 4 months continuously, the winds largely blow in the same direction. This predictable wind pattern enabled seamen and merchants in sail-powered vessels to ride these following winds across the Indian Ocean from Arabia and East Africa to India during one season, and then ride the prevailing wind back in the other direction in the next season. The environment of other Asian lands and of Central Africa are also powerfully influenced by these monsoons. There's no experience quite like the monsoon. Imagine hurricane-like torrents of rain pouring down every day for months. Yet that rain also has been vital for the entire Indian agricultural economy. As a result of continental drift, the Indian subcontinent now lies in the northern hemisphere, with the Tropic of Cancer running through its middle. So most of India tends to be quite hot throughout much of the year. Peninsular India reaches south almost to the equator, about as far south as Venezuela and the Congo. But the very far northern part of India, 1,500 miles away, lies in the Himalayan mountains, and it ranges between cool and very cold, with some glaciers. This northern region of India reaches as far north as Ohio, Portugal, and Japan. Hence, the Indian subcontinent has an extremely wide climatic range. Another effect of India being in the northern hemisphere is that starting in the spring, the sun beats more directly onto the land, so it heats up. Since the surrounding oceans do not heat up as quickly, the warmer air over the land rises up, drawing in winds from the southwest. These begin annually in June, and this southwest monsoon continues all summer. These southwest monsoons are heavily laden by moisture from the Indian Ocean. So when they hit the Western Ghats, they rise up, cool, and drop their moisture in the form of intense monsoon rains. Since these heavy rains make the land amazingly productive, the coastal plain west of these mountains can support a rich agricultural economy and is one of India's most densely populated regions. But often, this rainfall is so voluminous that cities, towns, and villages flood. Living with this very intense season of rain has always been a major factor in the lives of many of India's people. As the southwest monsoon continues beyond the Western Ghats, it loses much of its moisture. This means that the interior Deccan highland, even not very far from the coast, is much, much drier. Instead of wet crops like rice, the people living in the Deccan have historically planted dry crops like wheat and millet. Since wet crops are about 3 times as productive as dry ones, the population density reflects these differences. As the southwest monsoon continues across the Bay of Bengal, it again picks up moisture and energy. This means that as it curves northward, diverted by the landmass of Southeast Asia, it often produces cyclones, what are called hurricanes in the Atlantic, and typhoons in the Pacific. These dropped huge amounts of rainfall on the upper Indian eastern coast, mostly in the region of Bengal, which is half in India and half in Bangladesh today. People on this alluvial delta benefit from this heavy rainfall, making it the other most densely populated region on the subcontinent. But when a cyclone hits the low-lying coast, it can produce a disaster, with huge numbers of people flooded out or drowned. In areas just north of Bengal, a record 75 feet of rain has fallen in just the 3-month monsoon season. That's about 10 inches of rain every day. The southwest monsoon then continues up the Ganges plain, diverted by the looming Himalayan mountains. As it moves westward, this monsoon gradually decreases in its rainfall until little or none is left. There is consequently a gradual shift from wet rice to dry crops as you move west up the Ganges plain. Parts of the Punjab and parts of the upper Indus plain are quite arid, and much of Rajasthan is desert. Only with the mechanization of irrigation do the drier areas have the capacity to sustain intensive agriculture. And by autumn, the land is already cooled enough that the southwest monsoon pattern dissipates and begins to reverse. The oceans are now relatively warmer than the land. So the northeast monsoon begins to blow. Cool winds come off the Himalayan mountains, bringing frost to the upper Gangetic Plain, but limited rainfall. As the northeast monsoon passes over the Bay of Bengal, however, it picks up moisture. So the southeastern region of the Indian Peninsula receives much of its annual rain during the winter months. This annual cycle of 3 or 4 months of heavy rain, but then little rain during the rest of the year, has had profound effects on the people, their culture, and their largely agricultural economy. How did early people in India understand this annual cycle? How did they deal with the often excessive amounts of water for a few months, followed by shortages of it during the rest of the year? These issues will be important as we study India's long cultural and economic history. In addition, across India are several ecological niches. Each receives a different amount of rainfall and is often divided from the next region by mountains and rivers. Each also has its own specific ecosystem. Within each of these regions, each the size of an independent nation in Europe, distinctive cultures have developed over time. As an indication, the people of the subcontinent today speak more than 24 major languages, with hundreds of dialects. Each region has had its own political history, often independent, sometimes conquered by a neighboring region's ruler, occasionally the base for an expansive empire of its own. The demarcation and names for the area of people and cultures of the world that we will be considering in themselves contain much information. The term India often refers to the entire subcontinent, and we'll use it that way quite often. But since 1947, this Indian subcontinent has been partitioned into separate nations, the Republic of India and Pakistan with west and east wings, the latter seceding in 1971 to become Bangladesh. Hence, many scholars use the term South Asia to describe this region throughout time. Further, the term India is in itself loaded with meaning. The derivation of the name India comes from the Indus River, implying that India is the land beyond the Indus. So at first, only outsiders used it. The term Hindu also comes from this same term, again meaning the belief system of those other people living beyond the Indus River. Early European explorers used the term East Indies for both South and Southeast Asia. In contrast, they used West Indies, meaning the Caribbean. Over most of history, the people living in South Asia did not identify themselves as Indian or Hindu, at least until relatively recently. Rather, each region of South Asia had its own identity, and many people still strongly consider themselves as part of that regional culture, many regions having their own language. Likewise, what is today classed as Hinduism contains much diversity, including a range of beliefs, philosophies, and practices. Throughout these lectures, we will explore how these various regions and belief systems developed over time, as well as spread over India as a whole. We should also think about how we will be discussing the cultures and belief systems developed and held by the people of diverse cultures in India. We should also consider how we can include the perceptions of outsiders. One way to keep conscious of these different perspectives is to use a form of the linguistic term phonemic, meaning sounds recognized in the language being studied, and phonetic, meaning the way the trained linguists can classify those sounds and distinguish them from sounds used by other languages. All languages have sounds that are easy for native speakers to recognize, but which are often difficult for people learning that language later in life to perceive. That means native language speakers can often recognize the slight mispronunciation that many outsiders characteristically make when they are speaking. For example, many native English speakers don't hear the difference between the dental and a retroflex consonant, or a breathed or an unbreathed one. For example, T, 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 T are 4 different sounds. To most people in India, these differences are clear. That means the 4 different words not, 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 not can mean respectively a relative, a dancer, a lord, and destruction. These are thus unrelated words, although to many English speakers they sound the same. Likewise, many English speakers misspell the name of India's most famous leader, M.K. Gandhi, spelled G-A-N-D-H-I, since the GH sound is common in English, but the DH sound is not. Many times you see G-H-A-N-D-I, which is incorrect. In these lectures, we will use the linguistic concept more broadly. When we are speaking about the perceptions held by people of the culture being studied, we will use the term emic. Of course, in a culture as diverse as that of India, there are many different emic perspectives. In contrast, when we are speaking from the perspective of outsiders, we will refer to that as an etic viewpoint. Again, various outsiders have frequently asserted different interpretations of the same topic or event, so there is usually not just one etic explanation. Nonetheless, using emic and etic can help us understand the different meanings of the historical evidence we're using. For instance, the emic view of Mount Meru as the center of the cosmos and the etic view of the Himalaya mountains show complementary models of the Indian subcontinent. Having located India in its physical environment and atmospheric contexts, we can next turn in the coming lectures to how people began to settle in India. We will discuss how each of the earliest communities in India saw themselves, and also the other communities around them, emically, using evidence that they themselves produced. We will also see how we, as 21st century people, might view Indian history in etic terms.